This is lesson 1022 in the Russian Revolution. And our history quote today comes from Vladimir Lenin himself, the author of the Russian Revolution. He said, "Sometimes history needs a push." And boy, did he push this piece of history. Key people and terms of the Russian Revolution: Tsar Nicholas II, the Duma, the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, and Vladimir Lenin himself. And look, we've got another Vladimir to help us tell the story. That is the current Russian president, Vladimir Putin. So the big question is, why did World War I lead to revolution in Russia, and what was the outcome? Intro. Two things to understand from the outset. The Russian Revolution was one of modern history's most momentous events, and the new Soviet Union that followed represented a radically new prototype of state and society. Russia's leadership changed dramatically. Before the revolution, you had Tsar Nicholas II, and after the revolution, you had Vladimir Lenin. Background. By the early 20th century, Russian peasants lived in poverty while landowning nobles enjoyed wealth and leisure. The extreme gap between the rich and the poor made Russia ripe for revolution. Russia's military leadership was getting beaten badly by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. And in 1905, revolutions broke out across Russia. And this was known as the Russian Revolution of 1905. And it was a smaller, less transformative revolution than the one we're going to see happen in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II tried to stop the unrest. He granted limited reforms. He had a new representative assembly created, and this assembly was known as the Duma. Peasants were allowed to buy village lands privately. But he looked like, and was, an incompetent leader. The Russian economy showed signs of improvement. But then the First World War came along and hurt the Russian economy badly. Because in 1914, Tsar Nicholas II declared war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. 1/3 of all Russian men were forced into the army. As a result, 1/4 of all World War I casualties were suffered by Russia. How bad was the war for Russia? One description puts it this way: poorly trained and badly equipped Russian soldiers suffered disastrous defeats in World War I. Troops were even sent into battle without ammunition. They were told to pick up the weapons of their dead comrades. The Russian Revolution, the fall of Imperial Russia. Russia started World War I as enthusiastically as all the other countries. Tsar Nicholas II was popular for the moment. The Duma supported the war. Conservatives thought Russia would expand into the Balkans. Liberals thought that an alliance with Britain and France would bring social reforms to Russia. So why did Russian soldiers suffer disastrous defeats? Well, like the quote said, they were poorly trained and badly equipped. Many soldiers deserted. They just left and went home. Russian factories could not produce enough weapons or food for the war. Leadership was extremely weak. And Tsar Nicholas II distrusted the Duma because they were publicly elected by the people. In September 1915, the Duma called for Tsar Nicholas II to step down and let them take over. Instead, Nicholas II dismissed the Duma temporarily, and he announced that he was taking personal command of the army at the front, and his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, was left at home to run the Russian government, and she fired tons of able political advisors. Instead of having able political advisors around, the Tsarina Alexandra turned to Grigory Rasputin as almost her sole advisor. Rasputin was an uneducated peasant preacher and mystical faith healer from Siberia. He had undue influence over the entire royal family because he claimed he could heal their hemophiliac son, Alexis. Publicly, he was extremely unpopular and disreputable. The situation got so bad that 3 Russian aristocrats finally assassinated Rasputin. First, they tried to poison him with cyanide-laced cakes, tea, and wine. He ate and drank all that stuff, didn't even get sick. So they shot him in the chest. Then he got up from being shot in the chest and attacked them. So they finally shot him through the forehead, and then they threw him off a bridge. The scandal over the death of Grigory Rasputin further undermined support for Tsar Nicholas II's government. In 1917, German troops cut Russian railroad lines, which made Russia's problems even worse. This prevented food from reaching Russian cities and soldiers, and riots broke out across Russia, and these were called the subsistence riots. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, give up his throne, in March 1917. The Duma took over the country. That summer, Nicholas II and his family were arrested by the Duma and held as prisoners in a government mansion in the Ural Mountains of Russia. The whole thing was called the February Revolution of 1917. The leaders of the Duma declared Russia a republic in the year 1917. 3 centuries of czarist rule came to an end. The Duma established a provisional government for the country. They established equality before the law. They established freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. And they gave unions the right to strike. But in spite of all those good things, they refused to do the most important thing for the people at the moment, which was ending the war, getting the country out of World War I. The new prime minister was Alexander Kerensky, and he was a super patriot, and he saw continuing the war as a national duty. So he refused to get Russia out of the war. The Provisional Government also had to share power with another group, the Petrograd Soviet. This group was made up of about 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers, workers, and socialist intellectuals, and they saw themselves as the true grassroots protectors of the revolution and of democracy instead of the Duma. In the summer of 1917, this provisional government launched a new military campaign against Germany to defeat Germany once and for all. It was a complete disaster. The peasants started seizing land in a grassroots agrarian revolt. Soldiers deserted by the thousands to help their families get a share of that land. And Russia was descending into anarchy. The Bolsheviks were a revolutionary political party. They followed the ideas of Karl Marx, and we've talked about Karl Marx quite a few times already. He's the guy, as we said before, who said that capitalists just stole excess value from the workers, and that someday there would be a violent revolution, and that the workers of the world would take over, and that this revolution was inevitable. The Bolsheviks were led by the harsh Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin's brother had been executed for helping to assassinate Tsar Alexander III way back in 1887. So he had kind of an axe to grind. But Lenin also had the ability to be pragmatic and flexible if he had to be. Vladimir Lenin had 3 core beliefs as a Marxist. Number 1, only violent revolution could destroy capitalism. In other words, there was no room for gradual change or negotiation. Number 2, in an agricultural country like Russia, not very industrialized, the peasants could take place of Karl Marx's factory workers that you would have in a more industrialized country. And then number 3, the revolution would be driven by forceful, decisive leadership rather than by social inevitability. Karl Marx had said that the revolution wouldn't need any help. And it goes back to our history quote that Lenin had said, sometimes history needs a push. So the Bolsheviks. The word Bolshevik means majority, and this particular party could claim a slight majority among Marxists in the Duma. Their political campaign slogan was peace, bread, land, now. Thanks to Vladimir Lenin, the party members were tough, disciplined, and led from above. And they seized power in October 1917. Vladimir Lenin had been living in Switzerland until February 1917. The Germans had provided Lenin safe passage by train into Russia. They had hoped to undermine Russia's provisional government by sending him there. They had hoped this would take Russia out of the war. They got everything they hoped for, and a lot more. Soon after taking power, the Bolsheviks changed their name to Communists. Surprise! They also changed the name of the Russian Empire to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, or Soviet Union. And this new Soviet Union became the world's first communist nation. Leon Trotsky was the one who orchestrated the Bolshevik takeover. There were three reasons that the Bolsheviks were able to gain power. Number one, by late 1917, democracy in Russia had given way to anarchy. The power vacuum was wide open. Number two, Trotsky and Lenin provided superior leadership to that of the czarists and to that of the Provisional Government. And number three, the campaign slogan, "Peace, Bread, Land, Now," was a very appealing message to the Russian people. It contained everything they wanted: an end to the war, food, and land to work. Once in power, Lenin withdrew Russia from World War I. He signed a treaty with the Germans in which he gave up huge amounts of territory for peace, about a third of Russia. Approval of this treaty barely passed the assembly, and the treaty was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Vladimir Lenin then mandated land reform. As we just learned, peasants had already begun taking land from estates of landlords and from the church. So Lenin's land reform was really just endorsing what the peasants were already doing. Also, Vladimir Lenin mandated a decree which demanded that local Soviets, and Soviets are councils, take direct control over factories. This was also something that urban factory workers were already doing. Vladimir Lenin promised a new constituent assembly, which would be elected by the people, and it would draw up a new constitution for this new country. However, when these elections were held, the Bolsheviks lost. The big winners were the Socialist Revolutionary Party. So Lenin disbanded the Constituent Assembly on the first day it met with Bolshevik soldiers. He established a one-party state. In other words, Vladimir Lenin couldn't get power legitimately, so he used force. A civil war broke out across Russia. The non-communist, autocratic, czarist mix of liberals and conservatives were called the White Army. The White Army was helped by the allies of World War I, the U.S., France, and Britain. Many in the White Army had supported democracy and had seen that they were instead getting a dictatorship from Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Many different groups were united by their hate for communism. The White Army fought against the communist Red Army. No outside countries helped the Red Army. They all wanted the Red Army to lose. The war lasted from 1918 to 1921, with cleanup operations going on into 1923. The Bolshevik Communist Red Army eventually beat back the attacking White Army. There were several reasons for the Red Army's victory. Number one, Leon Trotsky's disciplined military leadership. There was also a lot of anger at all of the foreign intervention that came in on behalf of the White Army. The Red Army controlled central Russia, while the White Army had control of the Russian fringes. Number four, the Bolsheviks promised Russia's various ethnic groups more political autonomy. And number five, the war communism stance. The war communism stance consisted of three parts: A, nationalization and centralization of all industries and agriculture; B, a military draft; and C, terror. The Cheka, The secret police imprisoned and executed thousands. Meanwhile, on July 17, 1918, Nicholas II and his entire family were brutally murdered by their captors, the Bolshevik Ural Regional Soviet. Reasons given at the time were, number one, conspiracies to free the family, number two, the close proximity of the White Army, and number three, quote, unforgivable crimes against the nation. Here's a good YouTube link to a movie portrayal of the event. And below, here's another much more graphic and brutal version. You have been warned. Now that he was in complete control of Russia, Vladimir Lenin introduced a series of domestic changes. He transferred land to poorer peasants. Also, many factory workers were organized to control and operate the factories. And all industries were nationalized. In other words, taken over by the government. Questions for review. So what problems confronted Tsar Nicholas II? Why was the Duma established? How did the First World War harm Russia? Who were the Bolsheviks, and what did they promise to the Russian people? Who was Vladimir Lenin, and what did he do? And why do you think a civil war erupted in Russia after Vladimir Lenin seized power?